Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast here to tell you about Michelob Ultra Courtside. It's getting fans closer to the NBA with a chance to win prizes like courtside seats, a trip to All-Star Weekend, and much more. Check it out at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access, Courtside 24-25 sweepstakes, no purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 and up. Begins on October 1st, 2024, ends July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Behind those cozy nights at home, thousands of employees at BP go to work every day. People producing more U.S. natural gas. People building grid-scale solar capacity. People turning landfill waste gas into pipeline-quality renewable natural gas. And people delivering all of that power where it's needed. They're part of the more than 300,000 jobs BP supports across the country. Learn more at bp.com/investing in America.
Hello, welcome to another edition of the Ducks Confidential Podcast. I'm James Crepia, joined as always by Ryan Clark, and we'll be taking an early look at the Rose Bowl and Oregon's pending opponent between either Ohio State and Tennessee. We'll take a look at that matchup in the first round of the college football playoff coming up this week. We'll also touch on the week that was for the Ducks, where obviously there's no game, no kidding, but there was plenty going on between the awards week, that is customarily the week after the conference championship games, of course, culminating with the Heisman Trophy, and plenty of other awards as well. Some All-American teams going to be announced throughout the rest of this week, one already being announced, but we'll get to others there. Obviously, the transfer portal very much open for business, and Oregon already landing two very prominent additions at positions of need, and plenty of other areas to get into there. But we'll start with the awards week that was a Burlsworth Trophy for Bryce Boettcher, which, of course, for those who are unfamiliar, that is for the most outstanding player who began their career as a walk-on. So that's really, for all these awards where, yes, there's competition, of course there is, but that's one where you can literally say that pretty much anybody who's nominated for it, let alone who becomes a semifinalist or finalist, or obviously Bryce in winning it, those are all young men who have obviously put themselves in an awfully nice position in a football capacity, where to go from a walk-on to begin your career in that way. And then that doesn't mean that they're not still walk-ons now, by the way. This started your career as. It doesn't necessarily mean that you still are or aren't, but bottom line. But like I say, that's one where for anybody who's up for it, quite the accomplishment, and for Boettcher to win it, obviously a really nice token for him and the program as a whole.
Yeah, and something that I think says a lot about, the program's history of having players like this. You look back across the decades, but Boettcher stands at the top of a lot of folks' lists of all-time favorite Ducks in a lot of ways, just because of his local connection, because of his having started as a walk-on, and winning this award is sort of that validation of the program's culture, but also of the work that Boettcher put in to continue to play both sports and to excel at both, and to now have played as well as he has this year to give him an even greater chance of perhaps making an NFL career out of this, which would be obviously his decision and is yet to come as far as which direction the young man's going to go. Of course, he's got the opportunity with the Astros to work through their system on the baseball side, but incredible athlete, really like one of the spokespeople of this program as well. You think about somebody that we've talked to a lot this season in the media, and who has been able to articulate and orate, what is special about this team, and sort of the culture that they have going right now ahead of this national championship run. So, big ups to Boettcher for winning that award. And it was cool to see the genuine joy on the face of folks like Dan Lanning and Brian Michalowski and others who, tagged along to that awards ceremony to, see Bryce's hard work pay off in that way. It was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and then again, the week that was for other awards as well. Dillon Gabriel obviously up for many of them. Not surprisingly, and this is not a criticism by any stretch of the imagination, but not surprisingly, did not end up collecting any of the various awards that he was up for, whether that was the Maxwell, the Davey O'Brien, or the Heisman. And that's just because, honestly, look, there was some good competition out there.
This was a tough year to win any of those. Yes. I mean, this is one of those years for sure in every one of those categories.
When you're facing a situation where Travis Hunter is doing what he's doing, I mean, you just got to call it what it is. I mean, this is somebody who's doing something that we literally haven't seen in the modern game, and at the volume of snaps and at the speed of play that it's being done. We just haven't seen it. You know, if you want to go back to limited sample guys, whether you want to touch on Woodson slightly, Chris Gamble, but Gamble was not a Heisman contender. And if you will, really, really go back to, Jim Thorpe world. But ultimately, he's doing something that just simply has never been seen before. So I don't have a Heisman vote anymore these days. But if I did, I would have voted for Travis Hunter first and Ashton Jeanty second. And frankly, if somebody had voted for Jeanty first, I had no qualms, because similarly, he picked the wrong year to do something historic in his own right, when somebody like Travis Hunter is doing what he's doing. Because
and Gabriel behind two historic guys in that sense too, like a guy that would have won it almost any other year in second place, and then another historic guy in Hunter. Like that's tough for Gabriel in a year that, like, his stats were great, but they weren't, like, even if they were, blow your mind, like Mariota level stats, I mean, he still might not have won the dang thing.
No, this is a player doing something we've never seen, like I say, in the modern game, and Jeanty, who, depending on what they do in the playoffs, could very well break Barry Sanders' record. And that's one that, fast forward and tease it out and just say that he does. Forget about what Boise State does or doesn't do in the playoffs. Just say that Jeanty tops Sanders' record. No matter how many games, and I don't want to get into the per game stuff and competition or anything else. If you're in the record books, the all-time single-season leading rusher did not win the Heisman Trophy 10 and 15 and 20 years from now. That's going to be something to look back on in a different kind of historical lens. Having said that, I think it still stands the test of time, because what Travis Hunter is doing is through a historical lens. The part for Gabriel that I don't think got enough credit and love along the way was simply the performances against the better competition. And that was really where he separated himself compared to Hunter, Jeanty, and yes, Cam Ward, who was also Heisman Trophy finalist, or Cam Scadaboo, who finished fifth and was just outside those who was invited to New York. He played 4 ranked teams, and 3 of them had top 20 pass defenses. And that 2 of the teams that he played had top 5 pass defenses. And when you go through how he played against ranked teams, he had 11 touchdowns against ranked teams. That leads the country. He's the most efficient passer against ranked teams. Obviously, the 4 touchdowns against Penn State was the most against any top 10 pass defense, and it ended up dropping Penn State from the top 10 at this point because of how many yards they ended up putting up in that game, the Big Ten Championship. And then ultimately, even if you don't want to make it just about ranked or unranked, because, well, after all, or top 10 or what have you, because, well, Washington's a top 10 pass defense, but are they really necessarily at that level, or whatever the case is? How about just forget about all that and just say big moments? Or in the baseball analogy, or how it's applied there, late and close. How does a pitcher or hitter perform late and close? 7th inning and later, inside of 2 runs, inside of 3 runs, whatever the case is. Well, Oregon was trailing or holding a 1-score lead in the 4th quarter against 5 teams: Idaho, Boise State, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Penn State. And Gabriel goes 23 of 27 for 215 with a touchdown, 13 carries for 63 yards with a touchdown, and there was a fumble in there. And there were 4 game-winning drives, each of which ended in field goals. I mean, in the NFL, if you perform like that and lead your team on 4 game-winning drives and put yourself as the number 1 seed in the playoffs, you're called the MVP. Now, again, it's a different analogy. different sports, different competition. I get it. I get it. Not everything's created equal. I understand that. But point is for as much love and attention as Hunter and Gentry received, and deservedly so. And you can't say like Dillon Gabriel didn't get any love. He was the Heisman favorite in the preseason, and at one point, not that long ago, was back to being the favorite really in like late October, early November, shortly after the Ohio State game in particular. So you can't say as though, there were people bending over backwards not to appreciate what he was doing. But because there weren't the just long list of 350 plus yard games and 4 and 5 touchdown games, I think that clouded people's perspective at times where, frankly, who cares?
Yeah, and in the end, obviously Dillon would have loved these individual recognitions, and I'm sure he was happy enough to just be there in the first place, given all he's given to the college game. But at the end of the day, those traits that you're talking about, those traits of leadership, those abilities to come up clutch and make the big throws in the big moments, and to have the level of statistical performances that he did against those top schools, I mean, that's going to bode well if that continues into the playoff for Oregon. And all those individual accolades being set aside, Dillon Gabriel has an opportunity to sort of etch himself into Oregon history by going and winning the school's first national championship and being one of the key reasons why. And that's still very much on the table for these guys. And what a legacy that would leave beyond all of those trophies.
Without question. And ultimately, this is where I don't think the Heisman should make an adjustment. I don't. Because of history, and because ultimately the lion's share of teams are not going to be playoff teams. I don't care if they expand the field to 16 teams. The lion's share of teams are not going to be playoff teams. Now, the lion's share of the players who may win the Heisman may be on playoff teams, but that'll stand the test of time. Ultimately, I don't think the Heisman has to adjust, and you have to say, well, they should do it after the postseason. No, I don't think they have to do that. But I do think if the playoff gets to the point, particularly now with potentially 4 rounds for teams who have to play in the first round to make it all the way through, I do think there's something to be said for a playoff MVP, and that depending on how you play and exactly what you do, particularly at the quarterback position, that the playoff MVP may prove to be more reflective of excellence as a player than the Heisman might. I say
it could get into that. It could get into that sort of comparison culture that exists in college football already, right? If that award started to be compared to the Heisman, that's a legit that could be a legit thing. Yeah,
Hunters did something incredible, absolutely incredible. I'm not taking anything away from it. They didn't play a ranked team. Now, that's a little bit of happenstance by the way that their schedule broke in the Big 12. And again, time will tell. And all right, they got a bowl game or whatever. Right. But they didn't play a ranked team by the end of the season. You compare that to a team who would have to play 3 or 4 playoff games against, obviously, not just ranked, but probably, depending on conference champions being lower seeded or whatever, top 15 teams all the way or top 10 teams all the way. Who are you kidding? Again, especially we get to the point where this year was not a year of juggernauts necessarily, but especially if you get to years in the not too distant future where a couple of teams start to get built like Alabama was, or Georgia has been, or LSU was at different moments, or what have you. If you have to run through a gauntlet of 3 or 4 opponents that have 7 to 10 draft picks apiece, yeah, I think if you're the MVP as quarterback in 3 or 4 of those kinds of games, that carries a little bit of a different weight. So that's where I say I'm not sure what the Heisman's quote-unquote supposed to do. I would not adjust to the schedule if I were them, but I would consider such things in terms of how your own award is viewed as this playoff takes life in a different way. And again, I don't think it loses anything. I don't. But I do think that the playoff MVP, and I don't even know if they're awarding one separately, to be honest with you. But I think that as it expands, they probably have to and probably should. And even if they don't, that other outlets will, just because they'll fill the void. That person, that individual, depending on exactly how they perform, that may be, like I say, something that gets more appreciation from no less the fan base of the team who wins. And depending on exactly how they perform, it could get more appreciation from the masses. If it's one and the same person, well, then all right, then you add to your legend and lore, and you're one of the greats of all time. Well, that's the way it goes. Hey, what are you going to do? There's only so many Joe Burrows out there, and Joe Burrow seasons to be had out there. But that's why those players, again, reap the benefits of all that. So, be that as it may, again, a solid week on the award circuit. Even if he didn't bring home hardware for Gabriel, one honor that he did get. Among many beyond, yes, Big Ten Player of the Year from the coaches, the media, the AP, etc. Both he and Johnny Cornelius named second-team All-Americans by the AFCA. That's the Coaches Association. The first of the All-American teams that I've seen unveiled so far. There's 4 others in the official list, of course. Now, again, look, there's different voting contingents for each of these things, so don't try to make sense of it. There's no point. That's not you'll make your head hurt too much if you try to make sense of it all. There's various different voting contingents, but just to show you how whether things make sense, don't make sense, what have you. Johnny Cornelius was a third-team All Big Ten selection by the league's coaches, and second-team by the league's voting media as selected by the league. He was second-team All-American and the only offensive tackle from the Big Ten from the AFCA coaches who voted. Don't try to think too hard about this. I promise you it's not worth the time and effort to try to make logical sense of these things. I say it's different voting contingents, especially when you get into offensive line at times, including with All-Americans and all-conference things, at times you are living a little bit off reputation because, quite frankly, depending on exactly who the voting contingent is, some have absolutely no ability whatsoever to possibly judge the offensive line. It's not something they're schooled in, and I include myself in this, by the way. I vote in the Football Writers Association awards, among many others. It's not that easy, especially for the offensive line, because we're not getting all 22 camera angles. We're dealing with TV broadcast copy and everything else. And
a lot of folks that are voting on those awards aren't film junkies either.
And even if you were off broadcast film, what are you watching? Every game in America? I mean, come on, you got to be realistic.
It's a pretty serious expectation. Yeah.
No, so bottom line, you're going off of a combination of people you know by the preseason accolades and those sorts of things that they come in with by way of linemen, combined with Pro Football Focus grades. Not to say that they're the holy grail, but they give you some indication of caliber of play. All conference teams and the like, and then you try to whittle down some things. I'm just going through in terms of just general overarching process for either myself or others who vote for some of these things in the groups that do that. For the AFCA coaches, I have no idea, because they do have all 22, and that's something many of them probably played many of these players. So you hope that there's a little bit more reflective there. How and why they felt Cornelius is second-team All-American, while the Big Ten didn't even feel like he was all-conference for the first or second team. Again, send your complaints accordingly to Rosemont, Illinois, and let the conference office know. I don't know what to tell you, but bottom line, a nice honor for both Gabriel and Cornelius there. And again, there'll be the other All-American teams to roll out accordingly, and we'll see who else picks up honors along the way there. We'll shift to the playoff, though, and before we get into Ohio State, Tennessee, since Dan Lanning himself chose to weigh in on the barroom conversation of if there was anything to change about the playoff, what ought it be? Dan saying to Greg McElroy, that there were two aspects of it that he'd, if it were up to him, that he'd change. One being the long break between games, which may be fantastic for recovery, but ultimately to go from conference championship games and then have a national championship on January 20th by the end of it. And you had games, 2 weeks separate from conference championships for the first round, and then, the break all the way to January 1st for the teams at the bye, or 31st for the one game. And a championship game played all the way on the 20th. That's a long gap. And what Dan was saying basically was, if he had, to draw it up, that the national championship would be on January 1st, and that's where it would culminate. So, how you would back that up accordingly, whatever. And that for the rounds before the national championship, that those teams who position themselves accordingly would have home games up until that game, whether that be the semifinals, quarterfinals, and, well, if you were hosting in the first round, you ain't hosting a quarterfinal. But bottom line, you understand where he's coming from. Basically an NFL playoff style of home field advantage up until, of course, the championship. And in his perspective, the championship should be January 1. Personally, I think a lot of fans would love that, both the home game aspect and the timing aspect. I think there's only a couple of ways that you could ever pull it off logistically to fit all those games and all those rounds in and culminate on January 1, and that would be backing up the schedule, which has been discussed. They've talked about moving the whole season up to week 0, or just having a 2-bye season to begin with, regardless of the calendar. But even if you just back it up to week 0, and the conference championship games become the Saturday after Thanksgiving, then the Heisman is the week after that, and the award week, etc. How could you possibly cram it in and whatnot? But as Dan noted, I think a lot of bowls would be really frustrated with that. Yes, they would. And I could tell you that unless the Rose Bowl was the designated national championship site, which many people, myself included, have suggested that they do, that unless the Rose Bowl was the national championship site, that they specifically, that one game, that one entity, and as long as Jim Delaney is attached to it in any kind of advisory consultant role, that game will never not be either on January 1 or, if the NFL schedule dictates, January 2nd or whatever. But they will not be participating in anything of the like that would send the Rose Bowl to, December 15th or something. That's just not happening under any circumstance.
The Bulls wouldn't like it, obviously. They like the opportunity to have themselves be part of the playoff, to have the games have these big stakes and bigger TV numbers and draw bigger revenue, ticket sales. Everything else is affected and impacted by these choices. I do agree, I think, on principle with what Dan is saying, particularly the calendar piece of it. I think it's insane, and we're already seeing the ramifications of it with the transfer portal, that, teams are shedding players and having to worry about, not only, finishing out the high school recruiting, but, doing the work in the portal, while they're preparing for these massive games. And you look at the team that Oregon just played, Penn State, their backup quarterback, Drew Aller goes down in one of these playoff games, and they need somebody to step in who they trust. That guy's not going to be there. It's going to be their third string guy. So, that's only a small part of the picture, but more broadly, I think it would be really cool to see a team like Oregon or a team like Georgia, host a couple of games before they get to the national championship and just have the Natty be the only neutral site. I think that's an innovative and interesting idea. But like you pointed out, like, those bowl games are not going to surrender this opportunity. They're not going to be the also-rans who didn't make it into the 12-team playoff. You think about, like, even if the championship rotated and it was like the Sugar Bowl one year and the Rose Bowl another year, and like those New Year's Six bowls sort of traded off the opportunity, then you're looking at like a Rose Bowl with like the 15th ranked team versus like the 18th or something. Nobody cares. At that point, people would not really show up to those games as in as big a numbers as they might, and the bowl games themselves will lose out on a lot of revenue. So, that part's a tougher sell, I think, than the dates, which I think can be fixed. I think it's a long slog in the season, but had those first round games been played this past weekend, a week out from conference championship games, I don't think that that would have been the worst thing in the world for some of these teams. Yeah, they like 2 weeks to prepare for the playoff, but that being moved up and perhaps the next round, the quarterfinal round, being on the 21st would make a little more sense to me just from a logistical standpoint.
The calendar aspect is harder because traditionally speaking, the award week and the gap is there in part because of academics, believe it or not. Now, when they're getting paid now, and we'll see in terms of how much that's even taken into account in anything whatsoever going forward. But ultimately, the academic component, the academic calendar is a big part of it. It is legitimately a big part of it. How much that's ever taken into account going forward, we'll see. But that is a factor. That is something that was part of the process. To the neutral site aspect, we'll see with these playoff games this first Saturday. I mean, this is where we'll get into Ohio State, Tennessee, and obviously the winner advancing to play Oregon in the Rose Bowl. I have no doubt it's going to be captivating television. Absolutely. And believe me, they are going to love it, beyond love it, on Friday night in particular with Indiana at Notre Dame. And if it really does snow, television executives will be having early Christmas parties about such scenes to be able to show. I'm not talking about the entertainment value for those who aren't playing. That's not the issue. You could play them anywhere, and these games would be of entertainment value. That's not the point. I don't know, and we'll see. We'll see in time. I'm not going to go off a 4-game sample of this opening weekend either. Good, no matter what the weather is. It doesn't matter to me. I don't know if in the college space, when you're designing postseason, this isn't about conference championships or rivalry weekend. It's late November. It's already getting cold at a bunch of places, even in the South at times. No, you play the sport, the lion's share of the season, under certain conditions. Overwhelmingly pretty good weather conditions, if not really good, depending on what part of the country you're in. You play it at a certain time of year in a certain kind of condition. To now say, we're going to play the postseason, and by design, we are going to deliberately make it the most difficult, adverse, horrible condition we can possibly concoct and come up with. I don't know that that's ideal. I don't know that that's preferred. And that's not to just suddenly rally behind the bowl apparatus and that industrial complex, which has its own issues. But I do think that the idea and the concept of neutral sites, while not necessarily the most friendly for fans, we're going to try and make 3 and 4 rounds and the costs involved, and I very much respect and appreciate that. But to suddenly say, truly be honest, outside of the first year and the lore of it all, how many people would be really, really super jazzed about sitting outside at Autzen this upcoming Saturday if they were hosting a playoff game, where as of today the weather forecast is somewhere between 52 and 46, which is what a luxury compared to what it has been the last few days, and obviously raining. And depending on what part of the country you're in, that could be rain, that could be, look, Oregon played at Wisconsin. Everybody talked about it was going to be terrible weather. Ended up being great. But a week later, it was awfully cold. And then not that long after that, there was snow. This isn't the NFL. This isn't a matter of saying, well, the Packers play outside in Lambeau in the frozen time. They could play a significant part of the regular season under those conditions before you even worry about the playoffs. In college, the regular season does end when it does. And then it's got conference championship games in neutral sites, in domed stadiums. To now go and say, no, we're going to play outside 3 times in Madison, Wisconsin. I don't know. I don't know how fair that is to the players. Thinking about, again, I don't care about the TV side. I don't care about if you're sitting on your couch that it looks beautiful or whatever. Fine. I'm talking about for the people who actually put in the blood and sweat to actually accomplish the goal. I don't know how great that is for them. And it is different compared to the NFL because, like I say, in the NFL, one, they're getting paid a whole lot more. And two, you have and also a lot of dome stadiums, by the way. But even in the parts of the country where you are dealing with the elements, particularly Green Bay, since that's the one everybody's going to pull at, yeah, well, they can be dealing with those conditions in November and December. And now the NFL season gets into early January anyway. I don't know if you want to deliberately design a college football postseason setup where multiple rounds of play would be played under those such conditions. I'm not saying you shouldn't or absolutely can't be or be terrible. No, I'm saying I don't know how fair that is to players when they've played basically either 75, 85, or darn near 100% of the season under darn near pristine conditions by comparison. By the way, this has nothing to do with the South and whether they have good, bad, or otherwise. If you've never been down in the South in December, I can assure you it can get cold down there too, and snow. So this isn't a matter of, the Southern teams would be at a disadvantage. I don't care. If they're whatever. I'm talking just simply about the conditions aren't ideal. I don't care where the game's played.
Yeah, you wonder if maybe the other way could be better, where you go full neutral site for everything, and these sort of smaller bowls get a little lick off of this.
There was discussion of that. There was discussion of that before they moved to the home format for the opening weekend. That was a topic. That was a consideration.
It's a fun and exciting thing for campuses, but I think it very well could be a consideration, especially if you go through a few years of this and you constantly are in College Station or, like you said, Madison or any of these places where it's just brutality. Like, it doesn't have an impact on the games. It sounds great
wonderful,
in theory. Yeah.
But do you really want to play? I ask seriously. If you want to say Colorado made the playoff, forget just for Colorado's players. Do you really, again, the fans, the infrastructure, they know how to deal with it, and so, fine, that sounds great. And if you're not the one sitting outside when it's frigid or something like that, if it is in Boulder, asalu. But you mean to tell me you actually want to sit outside in the middle of a blizzard in the middle of January in Utah or Colorado and tell me that that's going to be reflective of 14 or 15 football games that have already been played by those teams? And that you're actually going to be really satisfied with the outcome merely because it looked pretty on TV? I don't think that's really terribly fair to the players. I don't.
Yeah, beyond just the difficulty of playing in those conditions, like your point, is it reflective of their entire season? Is it fair to a team that plays a certain style of football to have to play under those conditions versus another? Like, is it a true test? Is it a true playoff game? Yeah, it's I mean, people would point obviously to the NFL, but it's a different animal, like you said.
And again, how many teams even in the NFL are even playing outdoors anymore?
Yeah, very few, especially
regardless
in
of what part of the country. Again, like obviously Vegas is a dome, but it gets hot as heck. LA, I don't know if you call it a dome or quasi open, but whatever the case is, but SoFi is what it is. An open air covered stadium. Whatever. Bottom line, I think that's an element that has to be taken into consideration when we're talking about these things for the playoff, because I know a lot of people are going to fly off the handle about these games this weekend, about how incredible the scenes are, how amazing the crowds are, especially the first go-around where, But, one, if you ain't sitting out there, don't tell me about how pretty South Bend is or isn't. Just in general, or State College, or Columbus, or Austin. And Austin's supposed to be like in the 60s, so I don't think anybody can be complaining about that, but whatever. Don't tell me about how pretty it is from your couch. Actually sit out there and deal with it, and the tailgating and all the rest. And again, if you were a player, would you actually want that? That's the questions that I think should be asked. And that doesn't mean that you have to get to a particular conclusion, but I think those are some of the questions that need to be asked. Just different from the NFL postseason. That's all. Doesn't have to. Again, look, I'm going to be watching like everybody else, but we kind of have to. That is part of what we're doing here, especially Ohio State and Tennessee, and that's where we'll get to and wrap up this edition of the podcast. The Buckeyes and Volunteers will meet in Columbus on Saturday night in what will probably be a rather chilly setting in Columbus. and the winner advances to play Oregon in the Rose Bowl. Now, we're not going to get into every which part of the matchup. Obviously, that's for others to get into, and you can check out the fine work of our colleagues at Cleveland.com for the breakdowns of all things on Ohio State in particular. But bottom line, in terms of who would be the better matchup for Oregon, what's your take on this, Brian? Because I don't think there's a decisive answer one way or the other.
No, I think it's definitely close, and that's sort of to be expected from one of these 8-9 type matchups, right? Is, you know, two teams that are relatively even matched. They had similar seasons. They both have flaws. They both lost games they shouldn't have. That's really the case for pretty much everybody in this playoff. I think that there is an inclination on the part of the Oregon fan base in particular, but, you know, just I think neutrals in college football to think, oh, you know, Oregon got stuck with having to potentially face Ohio State again. But in my view, narrow as that difference might be between Ohio State and Tennessee, I think Ohio State is the quote unquote better matchup for Oregon in this situation. You can make an argument both ways, but, you know, Ohio State's injuries along their offensive line lends itself to a potentially feast-worthy day for a guy like Derek Harmon or Jamari Caldwell. And then, you know, the guys, you know, chasing after the Ohio State quarterback in that game with Mateo Uiagalelei and Jordan Birch. That could potentially be a factor in that matchup. And then, you know, with the way that Dillon Gabriel and Tez Johnson and all those guys carved up Penn State's secondary, the issues that have been readily apparent for a while with that Ohio State secondary, despite some of the individual talent, could make for a really strong day on that side of the ball for the Ducks as well. So the biggest thing, just, you know, other than those matchups that I think lends itself to Ohio State being the better one for Oregon is the familiarity. Like, yes, Ohio State has tape on you as well, but this is a much better Oregon team than at that point in their season. And this, I think, is a worse Ohio State team than at that point in the season when these two teams faced off last. So, you know, better the devil you know, as I believe our colleague Bill Oram wrote in our newsletter that we sent out to folks, than the one that you don't. And Nico Yamalavea is a young quarterback that's made some mistakes this year, but, you know, with his versatility and ability and you know, that Tennessee team that's been through the gauntlet of the SEC, I'd be a little more worried about them, if I'm being honest.
It's all perfectly valid points, because, yes, I mean, the bottom line, you point out the spots on the O-line in particular, that's where, if Ohio State is to win, that's where Oregon would have a very different kind of advantage compared to the regular season matchup. And those are things that aren't going to change. Those players who are out are out. That's just the way it's going to be. So that would absolutely be a favorable situation without question. I happen to think that Tennessee would be the quote-unquote better matchup. Even with that, narrowly so, though. This is not a matter of right or wrong. This is extremely close. And all of the points and arguments that Ryan laid out are, again, perfectly right and valid. I have no counter. I only point out that if you're getting into a statistical argument, you're splitting the most narrow of hairs, because in terms of caliber of performance on offense, caliber of performance on defense, these teams are awfully close, extremely close. So I don't even get into the statistical bit, because to me, what are we haggling over? To me, we're talking more about just overall depth of talent. And yeah, the line issue in particular is an area where Oregon could have a pretty nice advantage. Absolutely. But here's the thing. Will Howard is still the older and more composed quarterback compared to Nico. And he has weapons at a different level. Tennessee has some weapons. Dante Thornton is their leading receiver, formerly of Oregon. Leads the country in yards per reception at over 25 yards per reception. Yeah, they have threats. Don't get me wrong. But you can't compare Ohio State's receiving corps to Tennessee's receiving corps. You could get into the running back conversation because Ohio State has two, and Tennessee's he's not a name that is going to ring a lot of bells necessarily for Oregon fans, but you got a 1,400-yard rusher back there. So they're weapons. But I think Ohio State's weapons, even with an offensive line that is dealing with what it's dealing with by way of injury, I do think their depth of talent can better mask and overcome that deficiency. And it's a deficiency. There's no doubt about it. And then defensive side, Pierce for Tennessee is probably the best edge rusher on either of these two teams. But Ohio State has more than one guy or two guys. And that's where, and again, that's not looking past every which Tennessee defender. It's simply saying, I think the overall depth of high-end talent is greater on the Ohio State roster than it is at Tennessee. Not by a massive margin, but greater. Having said that, the other element of things, I think Josh Heupel's a better coach than Ryan Day. So even with maybe a little bit less talent to work with, I do think Josh Heupel would be a more difficult matchup to defend with what he's got compared to with Ryan Day and Chip Kelly, particularly coming off the game that they're coming off, because, oh boy. But I don't treat that Michigan game as an anomaly in terms of offensive game plan. I think that's turtles going back in their shell, metaphorically speaking.
And you think about the chess match that Oregon had with Penn State, too. That feels more likely to happen in a Tennessee matchup than an Ohio State one, especially with, not to say that it's 100% affecting him, but my God, there's a lot of outside noise and pressure on Ryan Day right now. And, even if you win that home game against Tennessee, there's still going to be some noise. And you lose that game to Oregon in the Rose Bowl, that noise is by no means gonna quiet down.
Oh, and again, there was already going to be Ohio State fans who showed up in Columbus rooting against their team just to hope that it would better create the argument to part ways. Now, with for all the Oregon fans losing their minds about a ticket fiasco, apparently there was quite the ticket fiasco in Columbus where the password protected tickets. Password wasn't exactly a heavily difficult and unbelievably nuanced. So apparently there's quite a large contingent of Tennessee fans who will be making the relatively short trek up to Columbus, and that there will be a sizable crowd rooting for those in orange and white. And it may not be everybody wearing an orange and white, but there will be a very large orange and white crowd, apparently, according to how things went down there. So, again, add it to the list. It'll be the last game of the 4 playoff games this weekend. It'll be the nightcap on Saturday night. And add to it, I guess Oregon draws the winner of it, and what should shape up to be, obviously, one of the more notable and memorable weekends in college football, not just this season, but, again, because it's the first go-around. Probably one that will have some pretty good lasting power in terms of living in people's memories for a while. And that goes with, first, quote-unquote quarterfinal games, first-round games, first quarterfinal games, with all the neutral sites and the playoffs and those things to come. But the on-campus element of this, again, I think will certainly be very exciting. I just, I just ask at times whether or not it's the most favorable situation for the players themselves, but I digress. Before we wrap up this edition of the podcast, and a reminder to everybody, if you don't already like, subscribe, 5-star review, etc., please do. It'll automatically populate in your feed, and it'll help grow this podcast as well as everybody else on the Oregonian Sports podcasts and the like. And we will have many editions of Ducks Confidential here leading up to the Rose Bowl and thereafter, as long as the playoff run continues. But before we wrap up on this edition, also get into the transfer portal, which, has been open for business for a week, and Oregon making 2 prominent additions there at 2 major positions of need, most especially at safety, which was the most glaring position of need on the defense, landing Dillon from Purdue, who was a freshman All-American a couple of years ago. He's got 2 years of eligibility to play, and he was the number 1 safety in the portal at this point. So they land his commitment. And then at cornerback, where there was a need, and a pretty big one in my estimation, because after all, you're going from 3 straight seasons of extreme cornerback 1 caliber of play to a degree of uncertainty as to who would be cornerback 1 or even cornerback 2 for that matter next season. And now you land a Tyron Johnson from Northwestern, where you go from Jabbar Muhammad, who was tied for the Big Ten lead in pass breakups on the season, despite barely being thrown at, to the number 1 player in the conference in terms of returning players at the quarterback position with 10 pass breakups. So Oregon lands 2 Big Ten defensive back transfers at 2 positions of need. Again, one who is the highest rated as position in the portal, and Tiananmen. And then with Johnson, as I say, from a production standpoint, let alone PFF grades or anything else, the most productive returning cornerback in the conference. Awfully nice place to be.
Yeah, that's a great place to start if you're Oregon, filling 2 needs. I think that Tiananmen's the one that is going to be the bigger headliner for folks just out of the gate because of his, success through the first 2 years of his career, and him being a guy that fills such an important role for this Ducks team and has a lot of NFL buzz too. I mean, this is a guy that, for the fact that he has 2 years of eligibility left, he might only need one of them if he's looking at some serious pro prospects after this next year. But obviously, Oregon fans would like to have him as long as possible. A guy with a ton of tackles, hard hitting safety that really gets it, and that Dan Lanning even praised ahead of that Purdue game. You think about the fact that Oregon went into Purdue 135 zip and then left to finish off their season, eventually to sign the best player from what was a pretty awful Purdue team. So that's quite a victory for Lanning and company. And then Johnson, I think, is probably going to fall under the radar for some Oregon fans, but he shouldn't. I think that you noted the PBUs is a big thing for a guy like that. Ton of experience, comes in with 4 years in the Northwestern program, so has been around college football a long time, and can plug into that Jabbar type role. Not saying that he's necessarily the same player as Jabbar, but if you're looking for a guy to potentially be your number 1 shutdown corner next year, he's absolutely in contention, and somebody that despite Northwestern's struggles, to be second team all Big Ten this year and to do what he did, including a pick 6 against Iowa, was pretty remarkable. So I think 2 really good additions, and then obviously more to come in the portal for Oregon.
Yeah, in terms of the positions of need going forward, and this is where we'll wrap up here. To me, I think in terms of relative hierarchy, the biggest areas of need that Oregon has are at tight end, specifically offensive tackle, inside linebacker, and I know a lot of folks are harping about interior defensive line as well. I get that. I'm saying relative to some of the others, I'd put all 3 of the others before interior defensive tackle. I'm not saying that they don't need it. No, they need it. Don't get it twisted. But there's a difference. The difference is hypothetically, if they didn't add a interior defensive lineman, what's the depth that's presently there? And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Derek Harmon elects to go to the NFL. I don't think that's exactly a big stretch. All right. Amari Washington is almost definitely going to be starting next season. He was contending to start this season before they brought in Harmon and Caldwell. Michael Gardner's coming off an injury. Terrence Green has played a good amount. Aiden Breland, Tion Gray, Jericho Johnson, Zadavian Sims. You've already got a pretty good amount of depth there. And yes, a lot of it's young, a lot of it's unproven, but you've got highly touted bodies who, some of whom have already redshirted and they're entering year 3 in Gardner and Green's case. So, hey, not for nothing. It's time to let the guys who you've brought in here and you've been developing, it's time to give them some opportunity and some run, too. Now, maybe they should be on the second spot on the 2 deep. I'm not arguing to the contrary, but there's a difference between that and looking at the tight end position and saying you've got Kenyon Sadiq, who obviously is having a very, very nice end of this season. We'll see how the playoff run goes. Roger Saliapaga, who hurt his knee, and I don't know, but when you're talking about entering spring practice, at the very least, probably going to be limited at best, I'd say. AJ Pugliano, who didn't play this season, and then Vanderploeg joined the group. That's the difference. When you're a team who likes to play 3 tight ends, entering spring practice, you might have 2, maybe, who could see the field. How are you going to have split squad anything? I know there's walk-ons, but you get my point. So I'm saying there's a difference in priority and pecking order of like, you got to get a tight end. You have to.
Yeah, and potentially multiple. Like they could get multiple experienced guys in the portal, and even like at the defensive tackle spot, it's not like they're going after a Derek Harmon type guy either. I think they trust the depth and the skill that they have with those young guys, and they're taking a flyer of sorts on Bear Alexander, and if they're able to bring him in and he takes his visit and he commits, that's great. That adds to what you already have in terms of young guys with potential at that position.
Other spots, as I say, are just a little bit higher priority, especially tight end, but again, into tackle, before you even know what Josh Connolly Jr. is going to do or not do. You're losing Cornelius. So your pie in the sky scenario is that Connolly comes back, and you've got Poncho still at center, with Bedford coming off the injury and looking for an additional year of eligibility. Yulee and Rogers also in that mix, to where one probably starts, the other one is the top backup to either side. And of course, again, Bedford has not just coming off this injury, but unfortunately has an injury history, so you can't take that for granted. And then when you're looking at the other tackle spot, you're looking at Janoris Wilson probably. And that's not a knock on him. I'm saying that's probably next who's up. And then, by the way, what's the line after that? And now you're down to freshmen. They have to add. Like, there is simply no other way around it. So, bottom line, that's where things will wrap up, and that's where things stand at this point. 1 week into the portal being open for business, and we'll see where the Ducks, move on from there. But there is definitely still some areas of need to add some experience. This is hardly a cause for concern. This is all drawn up that way when you're already looking on paper well before the season ever started. They were not going to have very many returning players who would be in line to be in their final year of eligibility, even if they all did not enter the NFL draft. And there's still decisions to be made by Jordan James, by Evan Stewart, by Josh Connolly, by Derek Harmon. So decisions to come. We'll see what happens there in the weeks ahead, and we'll see what happens in the portal, which may or may not be perhaps a little bit tipping of the hand in terms of what some of those NFL draft decisions might be before they're publicly announced. But we'll see that and report on that, obviously, in the days and weeks ahead. And obviously be paying attention to Ohio State, Tennessee, winner playing Oregon in the Rose Bowl, and all things there heading into this week as well. So for this edition of the podcast, again, as always, for myself, James Creppy, and Ryan Clark, we will bid you adieu and talk to you next week. And you'll be hearing from our colleagues, and Joe Freeman and Bill Oram as well. Until then, we will see you next week.